Hello, thanks for joining me again. To any night owls who are awake, I'm talking about the coronavirus, uh, and in fact, an article that I just came across whilst searching for evidence to my previous assertion that Trump was talking about Mexico and he was talking about potentially closing the US-Mexico border in response to the disease outbreak. Now, people talk a lot about how the coronavirus might hurt Trump because of the tanking stock market, etc. But over the long term, we also have to consider how the coronavirus outbreak may potentially help Trump. Now, the Ebola outbreak is shown to have helped the Republican Party in the 2014 midterm elections when there was a Democratic president. I've been trying to say this on the internet, but I haven't got much traction. So I think people need to start talking about it more. If you have any influence and you bring up the topic, these things hit a critical mass when enough people start paying attention. So I'm just going to put this on screen, an article published by the Washington Monthly that makes some interesting points. Trump could potentially benefit from a coronavirus pandemic. Let's look at his arguments. So this was published on February the 26th. And it says, yes, we should consider both how it could hurt or help Trump. So, yes, the risks to the president are evident. Efforts to contain the spread of COVID-19 are disrupting travel and the global supply chain, which has already led to a sharp downturn of the stock market. And the administration's reaction has been disjointed, dishonest, and contradictory, as well as appointing Mike Pence, a Republican governor who oversaw a significant outbreak of a contagious disease previously, and whose efforts contributed to that outbreak. When Mike Pence forbid needle exchange programs, and that helped facilitate the spread of HIV in Indiana. So this writer knows from consulting their own visceral fears of the virus that there's a strong impulse in the public to limit international travel and close the borders, which is a type of restrictionist narrative that fits in towards Trump brand fascism, where you say outside people are the threat, cut them off. I was also reading an article about the trade deficit and how Trump cast the trade deficit, the US trade deficit, as a huge problem and promised to address that in his 2016 campaign, started a trade war, which has done a lot of damage to American farming and manufacturing industries. But at the same time, the trade deficit has risen sharply under Trump, which isn't so terrible. It's just American services, American ingenuity are highly in demand. Not so much the products that America manufactures, but American intellectual property, American services, American jobs in that way are prime targets for investment by people elsewhere in the world, which contributes towards the trade deficit, illustrating that, the trade deficit was an imaginary problem or was mischaracterized as a significant problem in the first place. The trade deficit is a product of American excellence, and Trump's efforts to curtail the trade deficit have diminished job security and prosperity for a lot of Americans. So that could be another way in which Trump benefits from the coronavirus outbreak, in that he could hide some of the economic damage that he's done to not only the United States, but to the global economy by shuffling it all under the carpet of the devastation caused around to the global economy by the coronavirus itself. So let's notice that even before, I'm reading the article again now, even before the virus arrived in Europe, climate change, security concerns, and complaints about unfair trade had intensified anxieties about global air travel and globalized industrial supply chains. So that virus has been dealt another blow to slowing economies and has emboldened populists like Trump and also Bernie Sanders to revive calls for tougher controls over migrants, tourists, and even multinational corporations. Oh, look, this guy talks about it as well. The Republicans have used a public health scare to their advantage before, most notably when a few isolated cases of the Ebola virus showed up in the United States during the 2014 midterm cycle. So now I'm going to go to a study on that very phenomena of the 2014 midterms, and how Republicans were able to trade off that event to their political advantage. How's everybody going? Let's see if there's any comments. We've just got one little Trump troll making comments. Anybody else, feel free to jump in. I'm going to add, thanks, Brian. Thanks for being there. Okay. So this is the research. I've referenced it once before. It's probably too small for you guys to see with me, but it was published in 2016. I'll read a little bit of it for you just from the abstract, so that'll be brief. The results revealed that the psychological salience of Ebola was associated with increased intention to vote for Republican candidates. So the more you were aware about Ebola, the more upward trajectory to your intention of voting for a Republican candidate. So it motivated Republican turnout. And this effect occurred primarily in states characterized by norms favoring Republican Party candidates. So if you're already purple or red, leaning towards red, you saw an increased turnout for Republican candidates and increased determination to vote Republican. So this suggests that disease outbreaks may influence voter behavior in two psychologically distinct ways: increased inclination to vote for politically conservative candidates and increased inclination to conform to popular opinion. So that second characteristic is also a characteristic that helps an incumbent president. If you don't want to rock the boat, you have an increased desire to conform and keep everything the same, then yes, that gives more of a boost to Trump than you would want if you had an interest in preserving democracy and not letting a corrupt criminal showman, charlatan, conman, snake oil salesman type person occupy the White House for any longer than you could help. So I'm not going to complain too much. I'll just put myself back on again. Thanks. I'm not going to complain too much today about there being too many moderate candidates in the Democratic race, because since I last complained about it, two have dropped out, Tom Steyer and Pete Buttigieg. So Tom Steyer put everything he could into the South Carolina primary race. He fought very hard and spent a lot of his money. How many millions of dollars did he spend? Was it $44 million? Somebody else might have that information at hand. I don't. But he couldn't convince enough people to detract from Biden's convincing win in every single county in South Carolina. Following on from that lead, Pete Buttigieg has behaved patriotically and stepped down from the presidential race. He's been in long enough to have some fantastic successes and really be an important light for people who are gay and who might feel excluded from American society, from the embrace of American customs and norms. So he's shown you can still be gay and run for the highest office in the land and be met with considerable success. There's a lot of Pete Buttigieg fans out there, and some of them are probably hurting today. My heart goes out to you. I know you want what's best for your country. And that little piece of empathy is also going to make me try to say something nice about Republicans who still support Trump, which I don't really feel comfortable doing, but I'm trying to bring what I have to offer best to the table, which is an ability to try and understand people, or at least an interest in understanding others. So for those people who think Trump makes America safe and they don't self-reflect on what they actually mean by America and don't question whether or not Trump is just concentrating his efforts on trying to appear to make America safe, and also is implicitly promising white Americans that they are more special and that he will maintain white demographic dominance by curtailing immigration and reducing irregular immigration from Latin American, South American countries. Trump positions himself as the corrective to what a lot of people in America felt was an overly welcoming position. But at the same time, we must never forget that Trump is not representative of the middle of America, which is why he remains significantly unpopular, even though obviously we'd prefer him to be more unpopular, considering the people who read the news a lot like me and presumably people who watch me understand about Trump's corruption, the fact that he's paid himself millions upon millions of dollars from the public purse to golf at his own properties. Yes, Pete being gay definitely didn't guarantee that he was taking action to represent gay people, but representation matters at a symbolic level for people who are looking outwards to what happens in the world around them. So for people who are gay or who feel that they could potentially be gay, it was definitely a hopeful circumstance to have Pete Buttigieg succeeding so much as a candidate. And certainly Pete Buttigieg did have no pathway to to being a Dem primary candidate in any kind of long-term valid way, because he had no support from people of color, or no to negligible. And there were reasons for that. Firing the first Black police chief of the town he was mayor of, South Bend in Indiana, did not serve him well in demonstrating his credentials as a forward-thinking, inclusive person. So, yeah, that's fair. But at the same time, there were lots of qualities about Pete Buttigieg that made him attractive to people who wanted white Christianity to stand for something better than what Donald Trump has. So people were hoping that Pete could lure all of the Christians away from Trump. But of course, the Christians who stick with Trump aren't just looking for a good representative of Christian values. They're looking for more of an old school, tribalistic approach to Christianity, where you deride other people, they're not saved, they're going to hell, and you position yourself and your leaders as warriors for the unborn, and you excuse and overlook a whole bunch of crimes. So just as people in the evangelical church have often overlooked and excused abuse of women or sexual abuse of women and children, so too have they chosen to ignore Trump because he preserves the power structures that they have devoted their lives to. I've got to remember to practice pausing and make my sentences shorter, because it's hard work listening to a very long sentence. All right. I'm going to go back to the article I was sharing before. Let's see if I can put that back on screen. Done. Nope, that's not the right article. Okay. I want to add something else. I want to return to the article discussing whether or not Trump would benefit from a coronavirus pandemic. There's always ifs in every speculation. And the if is, how much can we ourselves, as members of the public, keep up the searchlight of attention on the ways in which the Trump administration is betraying the American public? So the article in Washington Monthly notes that fears of a coronavirus pandemic are many times more rational than fears of Ebola were in 2014, primarily because COVID is less lethal and also has a asymptomatic incubation period as well. So it's harder to identify and isolate people who are contagious, and it's quite possible to be infected with the virus and never know, but still be a vector for the disease who can spread it to someone else who may die. This kind of helplessness feeds panic, and panic will lead people to support illiberal policies they would never ordinarily consider. These points are very intimidating. Could also explain why some of the Trump administration's incompetence in relation to coronavirus may be purposeful. Some of the details we knew, and I can bring it up. The HHS people staff sent to Travis Air Base without protective gear. Okay. All right, so I'll share that with you guys. I'm looking at a New York Times article, which I can bring up on screen. Is it ever any use for you guys at all to see what I see? Do you like me sharing articles in the screen? So maybe you can just see the headline: US health workers responding to coronavirus lacked training and protective gear, whistleblower says. So, of course, the New York Times often does this. They've put in passive grammatical terms what happened, which is that these workers were sent to meet quarantined Americans without being given training gear. They didn't just happen to lack training and protective gear. They were sent without protective gear. They were sent without training by the US administration. The team was improperly deployed. That means that they were sent. They didn't just turn up, happen to be there. And a whistleblower tried to complain about this. Staff members from the Department of Health and Human Services Administration for Children and Families were sent to Travis Air Force Base and March Air Reserve Base in late January and early February, and were ordered to enter quarantined areas, including a hangar where coronavirus evacuees were being received. They were not provided safety protocol training until 5 days into their assignment. Without proper training or equipment, some of the exposed staff members moved freely around and off the bases, with at least one person staying in a nearby hotel and leaving California on a commercial flight. I soon began to field panicked calls from my leadership team and deployed staff members expressing concern with the lack of HHS communication and coordination, staff being sent into quarantined areas without personal protective equipment, training, or experience in managing public health emergencies. This whistleblower was also subject to professional retaliation. Now, I'm going to make a point here that it's likely you can't, yes, you can't, that's okay. At least you can hear me, guys. I might be less likely then to share an article. Brian's saying that he thinks Trump is deliberate in what he does and doesn't do. Yes. Yes, it's more comical that people aren't buying Corona beer, although, of course, sad for Corona beer sales executives. They might not even consciously be doing it. I'm fairly sure it's just an unconscious aversion to the word Corona, and people don't legitimately think that Corona beer has or carries the coronavirus. But unconscious purchases happen, and unconscious motivations for purchases or failure to purchase happen. What do I want to say? I was talking about how Trump is likely to have purposefully sent HHS staff to quarantined areas without protective gear, knowing that increased conformity means increased votes for incumbents. Oh, good, and it's been debunked anyway. There you go. It did seem a little ridiculous. Oh, yes, I wanted to say 9/11 was some time ago, but what if the emotional fallout from 9/11 is that Western democracies are suffering from increased levels of corruption, because the slow burn fallout has meant that not only 9/11, but the various smaller terror attacks since that time have increased people's dedication to vote for Conservatives, as if it's a necessary corrective to the integrated type of pluralism that we typically enjoy in multicultural societies, such as we have in the West, which have benefited and prospered from Enlightenment ideals that have gradually pushed us towards being more inclusive and allowing trade to be more liberal, and attitudes towards accepting people from different races to be more liberal, understanding that we can still be unified communities even when we're of diverse opinions, skin color, and faith background. So what if 9/11 was an open door to the fact that in Australia, the federal police aren't investigating allegations of corruption against a federal minister, a senior federal minister? They said they didn't feel the need to investigate the allegation, that they didn't see that any harm was done. In a case where a federal minister accused a Sydney mayor of having spent millions of dollars on her travel budget, which wasn't true, which was far from the case. And the paper that he was referring to was a fraudulent document. The police were going to investigate. Why was the minister quoting from a forged fraudulent document? In order to disparage the mayor of Sydney, who's an activist for taking climate change action. Turns out the federal minister's wife is running in the next election for the office of Sydney, Lord Mayor of Sydney. And yet the federal police said we didn't think any harm was done. They didn't interview the woman who was the victim in this circumstance, the current Lord Mayor of Sydney. And I'm just mentioning this because to me it seems parallel to all of the instances of corruption in the US, which, regardless of whether they're investigated or not, are often coming to unsatisfactory outcomes because Trump has carved out a position for himself where he has enough facilitators, enough enablers in the Republican Party and in other branches of government now that it's very hard to hold him to account. Oh, wow, you get a notification when I'm talking. I hope that doesn't wake you up. That's goodness gracious. So my argument about what needs to be done to mitigate this slide towards corruption is to do what we've already been doing, but let's do it more consciously. We are trying to raise the profile of the costs incurred by indulging corruption, the costs incurred to people when you have corrupt organizations that govern for the purposes of optics and don't govern for the good of the people. So I noticed someone from CNN called Fareed, I've forgotten his second name. He did a little expose on Bernie Sanders and how Sanders often talks about various Norwegian countries and how he wants to change America's system of governance so it reflects the positive outcomes associated with those more socialist countries. And Fareed pointed out that actually they have lower inheritance tax rates in the US, and the proportion of government income derived from taxing wealthy people is actually higher in the United States. So, Zakaria, thank you so much. Fareed Zakaria. So I might bring that up on screen because he didn't just present it on CNN, he also wrote a column about it for the Washington Post. And those figures were something I was unaware of. It's always good to know that as someone on the left, you might be too biased in favor of Scandinavian countries or Norwegian countries. I still think I should do more to read about it, but it turns out that, yes, the more socialized version of government that they were adopted led to a sort of stagnation in Sweden's economy. At one point, it wasn't creating any new private sector jobs. So they retained the high safety net, but they made their workforce much more flexible. They removed a lot of regulations around hiring and firing people, and they don't have a minimum wage. So it's important for me to look into those assertions. I too may have been guilty of looking with rose-colored goggles, or at least making overly broad assumptions about the economic stylings of those countries and the political stylings of those countries. But I have known for a while that, yes, Bernie Sanders talks about making things better, but has enacted very little legislation since he became a senator. So he seems to be someone who's more about pursuing power and telling an important story that resonates with Americans, that things could be improved. And Americans need to have a resuscitation of their hope that things could be improved, but also a resuscitation of their pragmatism, so that instead of putting all their emotional eggs in a presidency basket, oh, we've got a Democratic or Republican president now, everything will be fixed, to know that you need Congress and you need people from your party in positions of power in Congress. And without that, you can't easily get things done. So Trump lost the Republican majority in the Senate, but prior to that, he had the majority in the House and the Senate to help him enact legislation. The only trouble was his legislation was so cruel, the taking down of the Affordable Health Care Act, or Obamacare, without a replacement, was so cruel that John McCain felt compelled to sabotage it, even though he was a Republican senator. Trump lost the majority in the House. That's true. There's still a Republican majority in the Senate, and we can see how destructive the impact of that is, in that Mitch McConnell has over 400 bills passed in the House, sitting on his desk, that he won't even bring to a vote in the Senate because of the political destructiveness of seeing how people vote, how that would be for members of his fellow party, the Republican Party. If people got wind of how Republicans are likely to vote on measures that are publicly popular, protecting the election, protecting election security, or increasing election security, gun legislation such as strengthening background checks, all manner of legislation passed by the House that Mitch McConnell is stalling as if he's some all-powerful God, when he has the lowest approval rating apparently of any senator in the United States Senate. The Senate is very likely to stay red, yes, although if various factors align against Trumpism, and with a candidate like Biden and Harris as a presidential team package, perhaps some of those red Senate seats or purple Senate seats could be changed to blue. I'm big on keeping one's fears and estimations pragmatic, so I do take your opinion on board about the likelihood of the Senate remaining red. Still, Trump has done a lot of damage to America. It's just that damage is not readily perceived by Trump supporters, who are still brainwashed to feel threatened by Democrats and what they're told are democratic platforms of open borders. And the coronavirus pandemic is not likely to help the Democrats in that respect. Red states are likely to be redder because their response to fear and increased fear is to vote for the familiar and the customary. And in the case of Republicans, that is more Republican candidates. So that's all from me for now. Thank you so much to everyone who's listened. If you have your own ideas on ways in which we can effectively push back against the cyber war being conducted against the West, and indeed the internal war being conducted against the interests of the Western public by people like the Koch brothers, or the last remaining Koch brother, who's left alive? Was it Charles Koch who died? And anyway, that's less relevant. The important thing to note is that, so I'm distracted by a comment, which is a good comment. Someone says the Senate is going to stay representative or Republican majority. The best case is that Kentucky votes against Mitch and a few Dems win. Yeah, but I mean, it's still fairly close now. What is it, 51 to 48? 51 Republicans to 48 Democrats. And there were a lot of Republicans that said they weren't going to run again. Oh, yes, I was talking about the inclination of Republicans to vote for Republican candidates when they're afraid, and diseases are increasing their fearful states. A lot of Republicans are up for re-election this cycle, so I think it is a pretty advantageous to Dems election cycle. And yes, the composition of the Senate gives disproportionate power to states with relatively low population counts. So rural areas where people have less life experience, are less likely to have interacted with migrants and migrant families. Those people are disproportionately powerful, and their votes are disproportionately powerful. It's a bit unfortunate. But when America was founded, the founding fathers had to behave in a manner that was conciliatory towards wealthy landowners. And when you have a large-scale agricultural holding, you have more stuff than people. You have more things growing in your land than people, habitations for people. And in early American history, if you had a large plantation or a large agricultural holding, the people who did interact with your large agricultural holding were also slaves. So they didn't count in a voting sense. So yes, you've just made that point, that wealthy meant slave owners in early Americans, people who were profiting from labor stolen from imprisoned and oppressed people, forcibly taken from Africa and from African countries. So the vestigial concessions made to wealthy slave owners in American foundational history, their descendants and people who have been raised in that culture are now the people with disproportionate influence still in the Senate. Yes, so if we're talking about the 3/5 compromise, 3 out of every 5 slaves counted towards the population tally for a state, which would then increase how many representatives were derived from that state to be in the House of Representatives, but did not actually vote. 3 out of 5 slaves could not place a vote, but 3 out of every 5 slaves could enhance the population tally and therefore the political significance of any given state, which disproportionately awards power to places where there are more slaves. I have a commentator challenging my understanding of the 3/5 compromise, but I think you are perhaps misunderstanding me. I think in a mathematical sense, when slaves were 3/5 of a person, in a purely mathematical sense, they counted 3 out of every 5 slaves in the population tally. That's how it worked out, counting each slave as 3/5 of a person to be counted in a population tally. So you count how many slaves you have, you divide that number by 5 and then times it by 3. And then you add that number to the population tally, which means you have non-voters adding to your political significance as a state. And the very fact that you have lots of slaves in your state means culturally you endorse slavery. And when slavery ends and there's abolition, you have some unresolved issues and some potential unhealthy emotional attachment to a status quo where there's a hierarchy of worth and Black people deserve to occupy a lower place on that rung, and you haven't reconciled yourself to that change, that we in polite society no longer think it's okay to relegate people to a lower tier on a arbitrarily designated racial hierarchy, and that doing so normally attracts people a lot of criticism, but doing so covertly is something that still many, many people in America get away with, and is probably a large factor in the support for Trump, because he often explicitly as well as implicitly promises people that he will protect them from people who aren't white. In a voting sense, counting slaves towards a population tally doesn't actually award a slave any worth at all. It was just a way of giving wealthy slave owners extra electoral clout. So it's not as if the Three-Fifths Compromise awarded or assigned any worth. It wasn't as if slaves got to pass 3/5 of a vote each. There were no votes for slaves. The Three-Fifths Compromise is just a way of saying we are letting slave owners have an extra vote, or have their votes count for extra, because we want the wealthy slave owners to sign up to this new constitution thingy we're writing. So we're letting them have an extra cookie. Nobody else looked too closely at this. It's got humans in it. Ignore the fact that we are just trading on the fact that slaves are human beings to give extra stuff to slave owners without actually giving any extra stuff to slaves. So it wasn't as if people who were slaves got an increase in their rations because of being counted towards a population tally for calculating how many representatives were going to be taken from each state to represent their state in the House of Representatives. Okay. I'm talking in circles now, so we'll leave that point. I hope I've adequately explained my understanding of that piece of American history. And I will talk to you guys again soon. What's our resolve for the day? If you're not a Biden supporter yet, please consider it, because a Biden-Harris combination is broadly electorally appealing, and it means we're not stuck in any unresolved emotions about the 2016 election, meaning that we have to pretend that Elizabeth Warren will start succeeding any day now in winning states or getting a competitive number of delegates. Elizabeth Warren is not broadly popular enough to win in an electoral college scenario. Whatever virtues you ascribe to her, and I agree with you that she's very smart on her feet and intelligent and has a strong ability to express herself. And you can keep supporting her for now, I guess, because it might help protect us against a Bernie Sanders candidacy, which would be likely to deliver Trump a second term. Oh, good. I'm glad you have no problem switching to Biden from Warren. Excellent. Do that in your own good time, good people. I know it's like grief to let go of a political candidate for many people who invest a lot of time and energy and identity in supporting a particular candidate. But I do argue to Elizabeth Warren supporters that it doesn't undo the injustices of the past. It doesn't fix what happened to Hillary Clinton. And you can't impose a cure on people that aren't ready for a cure. Not that I'm trying to say Elizabeth Warren is equivalent to Hillary Clinton, because a lot of Black female voters online that I see online have told me or told the world that they don't think Elizabeth Warren is as strong a candidate as Hillary Clinton. And I pay close attention to what Black voters tell me, because they've been making some pretty good calls with respect to Donald Trump. And I'm talking in a broad electoral sense here. 94% of Black women voters did not vote for Donald Trump or voted for Hillary Clinton. And I think it's 80, in the early or late 80s% of Black men voted for Hillary Clinton. People would switch from a progressive to a moderate during the primary, because a lot of Elizabeth Warren supporters are actually more moderate than you might realize. And people might think that the best scenario for delivering progressive policy gains is for voting for a moderate who can win an electoral college scenario and can potentially follow progressive goals at a later stage. I mean, the Democrat Party is the Democratic Party is broad, and there's a lot of different ways to achieve progressive goals. And a lot of progressive or voters who support progressive candidates are often very critical of Obama, as if they're ignoring the fact that there was low Dem midterm turnout in 2014, sabotaging Obama's ability to make electoral progressive gains, because he didn't have people in Congress to vote for the policies he was intent on enacting. Yes, I'm sure Warren could be in a senior role in a Biden administration, because she's a policy wonk and she's a good surrogate for policies to help the American people, to reduce corruption, to prevent as much as is possible a recurrence of Trumpism and Trump-level corruption, to formalize some of the norms that we now know should not be taken for granted. But, I mean, look, Trump breaks norms and he breaks laws, because fascism is a very potent enabler. You get to trade on people's disaffection for the status quo. If people say, hey, the status quo hasn't kept us safe, or the status quo has let in too many people of color and I feel threatened, or I just have the susceptibility to hearing someone say everything's terrible and I alone will fix it, and get behind me and we're going to make other people cry in dismay and despair. There's a lot of bully type people who support Trump and don't pay so much attention to what he's doing. They pay attention to how he makes them feel. He makes them feel like powerful bullies who get to take other people's lunch money and then say, you know, I'm doing it for all the right reasons. Hillary Rodham Clinton cannot possibly make a reappearance at this stage of political drama in the US. But thanks for making the suggestion. So yes, people are not as committed to ideological lanes as you might think. People just find someone they can identify with, who they think will protect the people they care about, with a little bit of selflessness on the side of what's broadly best for their country. But most people still think in terms of what will benefit the people that they identify with. And look, some people have a nice broad concept of whom they identify with. Americans, bring it on. Migrants, bring it on. But a lot of Republicans don't identify with, they don't play nicely with others that much. They're more about acquisition of property and being kept safe from external threats from the rest of the world. Which is funny, because they've voted in a Russian asset who is undermining and weakening America, undermining its geopolitical standing in the world, etc. But their intention was to reduce the threat from external sources. And they perceived that Democrats were weak on issues such as protecting the US. Oh, I said I was going to go, and I'd better do that. Thanks, chaps, and talk to you again another time. Thanks for spending some of the hours of your night with me, and please suggest ways in which or feel free to suggest ways in which you think I could improve my content or my presentation style. I feel like I'm very much a work in progress, so I'm more open to criticism than you think. Yes. Thanks so much, Brian. Thanks, Julie. Someone asked if Sanders fans are similar to Trump's fans. No, but the Bernie bros have a lot in common with Trump fans. They're also people who've decided the best response to perceived threats is to play dirty and to, dox people and harass and belittle others. And I can see the temptation to that, because I've definitely had a lot of energy to employ Trump-style tactics on the internet and just be rude and denounce others. because sometimes if you feel like people aren't listening to you, that strategy can seem important, and that lack of civility can seem like an important way to say this problem's critical. Wake up, guys. I wouldn't be abandoning civility for no reason. But at the same time, to be persuasive, to bring the middle on board with your cause, civility is important, and taking the time to make your arguments persuasive, to show that you even understand the opposite point of view, or you understand how they might have arrived at them. Everybody's politics is all essentially a different shuffling of priorities. So people who say, no, but my priorities are the most important, I insist, are less persuasive than somebody saying, I can see how your priorities have some importance to you, but I'd suggest that this is a more critical threat for us to address at this point in time. That has more potential to win people over. But as we know, in American political races, it's not just about winning people over. It's about enthusing the people who are already on your side. I think a lot of people are very enthused to get Trump out of office. And a lot of Bernie supporters genuinely feel that he could. And they're overlooking concerns that other people have that say maybe Bernie wouldn't be a good fit for an election in which it's not just the popular vote, it's the electoral college system. And Bernie won't have Trump's backing to pervert the election in the same way that Trump did. Bernie's got an amount of support that will go so far, but that's probably to just install Bernie as a candidate and then undermine him if it comes down to a Sanders-Trump showdown. The Russians are comfortable with Trump in power. They don't need to try and install Bernie. They've got a man who's working towards winding down sanctions against the Russian government. Trump is winding down Republican efforts to protect and help Ukraine. So you're welcome. Thank you for caring. If you've been sheltered from the Bernie bros online, that's nice for you. All the best in your journeys, everyone. Take care. My recommendations for coronavirus is lots of hand washing, maybe even disposable gloves if you have to go to a crowded event. Masks are just if you're sick and you don't want to pass on your potential cough to anybody else, or if you work on the front lines of healthcare. So if you're a healthcare worker, sure, wear a mask. For everybody else, it's not the best preventative measure. Just practice not touching your eyes, your nose, and your mouth as much as you can. Stockpile a little bit of perishable food in case you're confined to your house for a few weeks, maybe even some bottled water. Wipe down doorknobs and things if you're sick, and maybe just start doing that anyway. What other advice can we give? Not to panic, but to keep up the pressure on the Trump administration that they should be accountable for the mistakes that they've made and continue to make. The cuts to global health, to pandemic response units, to hospital readiness, to CDC preparedness levels, etc., as well as purposefully sending HHS staff to quarantined areas on the Travis military base and the March air base, where people spent 5 days without protective training or without protective gear or training in health protocols around infectious people. So keep their hands to the ground. Oh yes, wash hands, wash your thumbs, wash your wrists. I showed my son a picture of areas that are often neglected when we wash our hands. I might share that with you guys next time. My son was very taken by it, and I could see him taking extra care to wash all of those occasionally neglected areas. From memory, I think it was sort of fingertip areas and parts of your thumb. So yes, pay attention to Brian. He's a healthcare worker. Thank you, Brian. All the best, everybody. Bye-bye.